Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and my next guest is Andrew Puzder. He is the former CEO of CKE Restaurants, which owns a few restaurants you may know about. These are restaurant chains, Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. And he's written a fascinating new book about what may be happening within your 401k or pension fund. The book is called A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Andy. Good to be here.
So I want to talk about the book, but we have to start with today's events. And just curious what you think about Trump's second presidency and what it will mean for the broader topic of your book, which is really a defense of free market capitalism.
I think it'll be a real boon for free market capitalism. I wrote another book back in 2018 called The Capitalist Comeback, the Trump boom and the left's plot to stop it. And I guess I could write that again today. The themes would be very, very much the same. I think the left will plot to stop it, although this time the plotting hasn't begun as aggressively or as soon as it did back in 2018. Even Bernie Sanders is out there saying, look, I'll work with President Trump on the issues where we agree, issues where we don't agree, I won't work with him. But at least there's this idea out there that he can be worked with. We've got major companies in the United States which did not support President Trump in either 2016, 2020, or 2024 have now, come on the team, are supporting his inauguration. I think we're going to see big changes, and we needed big changes because the last 4 years have been a disaster, not only for the country, but for our representative democracy and our free market economy.
Yeah. So let's talk about this book, your book in particular. It's just out. Why did you write it now? And I guess that's the question. Why did you write it, and why did you write it now?
Well, I thought it was important for people to understand exactly what was happening with stakeholder capitalism, which is really the notion that instead of corporations having an obligation to investors, which in the case of pension fund and 401k plans would be the recipients of those funds, that corporations somehow have this broader duty to their stakeholders, so-called stakeholders, which is interesting. They call it stakeholders because they have no stake in the company. They have no investment there. Your consumers, your employees, your suppliers, your communities, that there's an obligation to all of them, which really are a proxy for society. So these massive investment firms want to be able to force their social and political goals on American corporations because they vote tremendous amounts of shares in those corporations. But to do that, they needed to have a duty other than their duty to their investors. They needed to have a duty more to society. So they've used this Klaus Schwab created economic theory of stakeholder capitalism, Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum fame, as a way to expand the group of people to whom they owe duties so they can impose their social and political policies on us, this radical, woke, leftist agenda, because they want to impose it on us because all in the name of protecting us, right? Because they don't trust us to make decisions for ourselves, our nation, or our planet. And I thought people should understand that and where we are in that fight.
So, so this sort of gets to the heart of what's called passive investing or index fund investing. It's really one of the most important financial ideas of the 20th century. And as I mentioned to you before we came on, I've had the opportunity to talk with Burt Malkiel. He's one of the fathers of passive investing. And the idea is that no single active investment manager can beat the market as a whole. And the idea is so powerful and accepted today that trillions of dollars are now managed using this technique where you buy an index fund. But I guess what you're saying is that these index fund managers, and you talk about the three largest, BlackRock, State Street, and Fidelity, are now Vanguard, I'm sorry, yeah, are so powerful that they now influence these gigantic public companies that they invest in. And I'm talking about Exxon, I'm talking about Disney, I'm talking about Boeing. And I'm wondering in your idea, is it the original sin that they use their power to affect investment decisions or affect the management of these companies that they invest in so-called passively? Is that the problem, or is it that they use their power for a bunch of ideas that you don't like and you think are bad for the companies themselves, meaning these sort of woke agenda items, which you talk about a lot in your book?
Yeah, it's very much the former, and I'll explain why. For example, with the S&P 500, which is the most popular index in the country for all of these investment managers, the idea is that rather than picking out of the 500 biggest companies in America, picking 10 or 15 or 20 that you're going to analyze and follow very closely and sell when they do well, and buy when you think they're going to do well, sell when you think they're going to do bad. With a passive fund, your fund manager buys all 500, an interest in all 500 companies, and you don't have to do the kind of detailed research that you have to do if you're actively picking companies. So it's a much cheaper way to invest, and it's also very difficult to pick which companies are going to perform the best. So if you diversify your investment to all 500, your risk is a lot lower, your fees are a lot lower, and historically the returns have been higher. So it's a great way to invest, particularly for pension funds and people that are looking for retirement income. But the idea is that you're voting in the 500 leading companies in the United States. They probably have 500 great CEOs, all striving to make their companies profitable. They probably have pretty good products, which is how they got to be in the 500 best companies. Probably are profitable, probably have low debt. All of the things that are required for a business to be successful. Now, you don't want to direct them all in the same direction. You want those 500 CEOs out there striving to make each of their individual companies profitable. So, for example, Exxon shouldn't be adopting net zero carbon emissions goals because it's an oil and gas company. On the other hand, a solar panel company should be advocating maybe for net zero goals because it's making solar panels. So you have all of these companies in the S&P 500, and there are oil companies and solar panel manufacturers striving to be as profitable as they possibly can be. The problem is that these three largest investment firms, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, have really become this unprecedented, huge financial Cerberus, this three-headed monster that really dominates the American economy because they manage $21 to $23 trillion, which is about 80% of US GDP. That's $65,000 per person in the United States. It's more than the GDP of every country in the world other than China and the United States. They are the major shareholder. If you combine their holdings, they're the major shareholder in 80% of the companies in the S&P 500, and they're significant shareholders in 100% of the companies in the S&P 500. So they can really let the CEOs of these various companies know, hey, we're not going to vote for your directors if you don't follow this particular policy. We're going to vote for shareholder resolutions that will hurt your company and hurt you and put you in a different direction if you don't do what we tell you to do. So they really exert a tremendous amount of power over America's CEOs. I ran a publicly traded company. I ran the company for 17 years. For 10 years, we were a New York Stock Exchange company. And I can tell you, when your major shareholder asks you to do something and tells you what they think, you listen very closely. You ignore the big three at risk to your job, as Exxon learned. So This is why we're seeing, I'm sure your listeners have seen it across the board. We're seeing these huge US companies doing things that make absolutely no sense to you. Why would Disney and Target, family-friendly companies, let alone Anheuser-Busch that's trying to sell beer to guys, why would they adopt a transgender agenda? Why would ExxonMobil and Chevron adopt net zero carbon emission policies when their business is oil and gas? Well, the reason is because there really is this small group of financial elites dictating policy for American companies. It's very damaging to the economy and damaging to the companies.
So, hey, I'm Andrew Walworth, just so you listeners know. I'm talking with Andrew Puzder. He's the author of this new book, Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. I highly commend it to you. Fascinating stuff. Wouldn't the market, though, and you're a big market guy, Andrew, would the market correct for this eventually? In other words, if I'm full disclosure, of course, I, like a lot of our listeners, probably have their money in a retirement fund. I know it's put in a bunch of these index funds that we've talked about. If that index fund, because it's forcing its companies to do something that's bad for shareholder return, wouldn't that show up? And wouldn't I say eventually, in the marketplace, hey, get me out of that fund, put me in a fund that's doing better, that's truly passive? I would think that would be the argument. Is that happening, or can that not happen because the players are so big?
Well, number one, because these players are so big, there are no funds that are truly passive. They're all directed by State Street, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So while they're returning less than they would otherwise return because they're driving down the returns for certain companies in that index, they're not. You really have nothing to compare it to. You can't say, well, we'll compare it to this other S&P 500 that's passively managed. That isn't the way this works. The problem is, I thought when I first heard about stakeholder capitalism and ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance, which is really the agenda for these stakeholder capitalists, when I first heard about it, I thought this will never happen because the stockholders will say, hey, no, we want returns. You can't manage money like this. You're doing things that cut against the profitability of the company, and shareholder and CEOs would react to the shareholders claiming that they weren't doing their job. The problem, what I didn't realize at that time, which I came to realize later, this is like 2019 or 20, what I came to realize later was the investors aren't actually voting these shares. If investors were voting the shares, I would have no worries about stakeholder capitalists. The problem is you have these massive fund managers intent on implementing these social and political goals who are voting the shares. So they're really not incentivizing the CEOs to do what would generate returns. They're voting the shares to incentivize CEOs to enact these social and political policies, DEI, ESG, diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental, social, and governance, which advance these progressive ideologies. So it really has turned capitalism and shareholder capitalism, free market capitalism, what Milton Friedman talks so much about, it's really turned all of that on its head.
Yeah. So, Andrew, I got about a minute left here. And I'm just curious, is this changing at all? And especially with the Trump administration coming in through the SEC or other mechanisms, do you think there'll be a pushback from the government on DEI investing?
Well, there have been pushback already from blue states, from Republican-led states, and some from
red states. You mean?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, red states. I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, red states. How are we? Yes, red states, Republican-controlled states, passing fiduciary duty legislation, making it clear that this violates state laws. There have been lawsuits filed. 11 attorney generals filed an antitrust suit. The House Judiciary Committee came out and said they thought BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard had engaged in a cartel to suppress the free market with respect to energy. So there's been reaction, and these entities have been dropping out of these climate activist groups that they were actually members of these climate activist groups. They've been dropping out, but I really want to look to they give proxy voting guidelines, which I have not seen any changes to. They still seem to be advocating the same policies that they've always advocated, ESG and DEI. And they've converted so much of the American business community to this ESG agenda. We need to see whether companies start to back off of that. Are they compensating their officers and directors based upon achieving these ESG goals? Is management being compensated because of DEI or ESG environmental goals? If that doesn't change, then we've lost this fight. And so far, we're not seeing that change. So we've had some victories, but if we let up, if we take our foot off the gas pedal on this, it's going to go right back to this stakeholder philosophy, which is bad for investors, bad for the economy, and bad for our free markets.
Well, Andy, really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. It's an important topic. I'm Andrew Walworth. My guest has been Andrew Puzder. He's the author of a new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. Thanks for being with us. We'll be back tomorrow with more, so we'll see you then. Thanks for listening.